Good day, folks. My name is John, and this is a special edition of Hovering Over the Deep. Today, very exciting, I have with me my wife. You hear me talk about my wife a lot, and she's quite wonderful, and she is quite wise, and she says a lot of wonderful things. And to be sure, this is our, I guess you could call this the special Christmas episode for my whole three listeners out there and all those who might ever download this podcast. So anyways, this is my wife, Angel.
Hello.
And, we've actually been having a lot of conversations on what we do. And as such, we were talking the other day. It's like, hey, you should do a podcast with me. And so we kind of went over it back and forth and how we would do it. And we just said, we have a lot of good discussions. We think our discussions would be, meritorious for those people out there who are interested in some kind of philosophical discourse and theological discourse. And so this is going to be a little different. So I've got a little haphazard setup right now in my studio room. Levels are clipping all over the place. We have one microphone. And this is really not in any way that I would want to do this, but this is what we got. So, anyways, hi, Angel.
Hi, John.
How are you?
I'm doing good.
That's good. So, to give you some background on Angel, she is a marriage and family counselor by education, but also a theologian as well, kind of like I am, in a different sense. How would you describe your theological proclivities compared to mine?
I'm kind of really interested in the intersection between psychology and philosophy, and kind of have coined my own term, psychosophy, which is a combination of the two Greek terms for wisdom and soul. So psychosophy kind of being soul wisdom in a lot of cases, but again, it's more of the intersection between psychology and philosophy.
And I think we discovered that you weren't actually, I mean, I know you coined it, but it's kind of like that zeitgeist idea. It's like, everybody else comes up with an idea of something like that. But I think we discovered that somebody else used that term.
Yeah, about 100 years ago, there was another gentleman, early 20th century, who also used that term for, I think, an entirely different philosophical school of thought.
Yeah. But, it's kind of like one of those things. It's like you coined it, but if somebody else coined it, but it's like, and that's kind of the thing that we live in this world. It's like you can coin so many terms like, oh, I came up with this idea, and then you dig up some vague reference to somebody else who coined a term. But for all intents, I think it would be fair to say that in 2019, completely unrelated to anybody else, based on your own knowledge and zeitgeist of pulling information together, you effectively came up with that on your own. Not to discredit the other person, but for this purposes, you did effectively.
Right. Well, because again, I'm very interested in, because psychology used to be almost interchangeable with philosophy. It really wasn't until much later in the development of the thought and where psychology became its own discipline that you started to see it kind of pulling away from its philosophical roots. And in a lot of cases, I'm kind of trying to recapture that. Yeah.
And that's kind of fascinating, because today we live in a very I don't want to say anti-philosophical world, but it's a world that is very divorced from philosophy and theology. And you've heard me complain about this multiple times, that what amounts to a philosopher nowadays is not somebody who is a lover of knowledge per se, but somebody who likes to quote and requote philosophers who have long since come and gone. And it's like, we don't really have philosophers today who are lovers of knowledge in the classical sense. But again, it's like, oh, I got a degree in philosophy. It's like, great. What do you do? And you're like, oh, I'm just going to quote everybody else. And it's like, well, I'm glad you're quoting all these people, and that's fabulous. But what thought, what philosophy, how are you bringing that together in practical application and philosophizing in your own right? And I think you do that. You actually do that a lot more than most people, most others do. You really bring that together. And I'm very thankful, because you're my wife and I get to hear it all the time. So isn't that fun?
Well, that's a kind of a good way to segue into kind of what I was hoping we could talk about, and just sort of the insidious nature of that, removing philosophical understanding from the popular discussion when it comes to psychology. And the big term that everyone likes to use, mental health. Mental illness. And the fact that we can only discuss mental health and mental illness using what is now termed the medical model, and very clinical language that you find in things like the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of the American Psychological Association. And because we are only allowed to discuss the phenomenological experience or sort of our lived and felt sense of how we navigate this thing we call reality, we're only allowed to discuss that using medical or clinical terms. In a lot of cases, it's almost like removing the ability to describe the color red from one's vocabulary, since that's been taken away. How do we discuss that? How do we access that? And so again, you're seeing this very insidious change in the ability to use these terms. And when you rip away the ability to formulate thought, you've in a lot of cases blinded the soul's eye in a lot of cases to describe, again, a phenomenological experience.
And it's interesting to me because I remember, one of the, being, I guess you could say a student of the internet, as it were, I am absolutely cognizant. One of the rallying cries that you started to see is like, we need to remove the stigma of mental illness and mental health. And it's like, well, I mean, yeah, there's stigma, sure, but at the same time, there is a reason why we should look at it seriously, I think. And now it seems like everybody's got mental health proclivities and predilections. Everybody has some mental health malady, and you and I have talked about this to great extent. And can I say this one, because I think you know where I'm going with this, but the nefarious nature of how we have changed the terminology in the vernacular. And I've had this conversation with multiple people as of late, especially in our job. My wife and I, it's not unknown that we own a coffee shop, and that's kind of what, so we had the privilege of talking to a lot of people. And one of the privileges of being on the other side of the counter is that you interact with a lot of people, and you start to notice certain things. And I've heard this phrase being tossed around a lot. And it's nefarious because the phrase has just changed from what it used to be to what it is today. And that phrase is my depression. And that's interesting to me. My depression. Because now it's like, it used to be that people said, I have depression, or I'm feeling depressed, or something along those lines. And something has changed now where it's like, instead of like, man, I'm really depressed today, it's like, my depression is acting up. It's almost like they're treating it like some kind of like reoccurring a malady, and like it's like arthritis. It's like, well, it's cold out, my arthritis is acting up again, my trick knee is about ready to give out under me, I know it's going to rain, my it's like my depression. Like, wow, where did this come from? And I have a theory about it, I have a thought about it, and that thought is really more so a lot of the group think on the internet a lot. We have the global discussion. Everybody's talking about how miserable they are. It's ironic in a way, because when we were younger, we used to see all the old people gathering around talking about how miserable and messed up their lives were because they had to go to the doctor and get this and that checked out. And now everybody's just talking about all of their maladies online. It's like, oh, I got the depression again. The depression's is back. It's like, okay, guys, we need to take a step back here, because guess what? Somehow that obfuscation of vernacular has created a very unfortunate worldview, and it's nefarious. It is nefarious. I mean, and you're experiencing that right now. I'm you're not experiencing the depressions, but you're experiencing that in a lot of the conversations you're having.
Well, and you hit the nail on the head. Again, it's that interesting semantic shift from I feel depressed to I have depression. And again, when we've changed the language where depression is an emotion, it's a feeling, it's something that comes and goes. We all experience emotions. We understand that what we feel from one moment to the next can change. That is the nature of emotions. But when we change the terminology where depression is just an emotion that may come and go to I have depression, the same way that I have cancer or I have the common cold, it changes the entire way that you look at one's mental health. And now it becomes an illness instead of just a state of being. And when it becomes an illness, suddenly you no longer have volition. You can't do anything about it. When you get the cold, you can just eat chicken noodle soup, sit on the couch. You just sort of have to wait for it to pass. In the same way, if I have depression, instead of feeling depression, I just have to wait for it to run its course. Suddenly, my ability to willfully act, to use my volition, to have culpability in that moment is taken away. And again, it really comes down to the shift in how we're describing these things. Do I feel depressed or do I have depression?
Well, and look at what they do. We've heard this one before, and I'm not going to name names because that would be inappropriate. But one of the things that I do recall growing up was I have a chemical imbalance. I have a chemical imbalance, and therefore, because I have a chemical imbalance, therefore I have depression. Now, that's an interesting one because whenever you make a determination of what is balanced or what is not balanced, you have to have a baseline. You have to have like what is a normal standard before you can determine what is an abnormal standard. And that's how we define normalcy. We have something that is baseline. I know what I know what a crooked line is because I know what a straight line is. I know what bad fruit looks like because we have good fruit. I think that's like an Augustinian thing or something like that. How do we determine good and bad? And it's interesting to me because. And you brought this up and you pointed this out when you were going through your education, is how do we know which came first, the chemical imbalance or the act that caused you to be depressed that caused the chemical imbalance? And it's so frustrating to me to talk to so many people nowadays because at least maybe I would even say as short as like 20 to maybe, and I have to remember how old I am now because I'm getting older. So like yesterday is a little bit farther away than I recall it being, but within 10 to 20 years, it's fascinating to me that what we are being given as real, what we are being told has just subtly shifted. I have a chemical imbalance, therefore I'm depressed. Versus I have depression. And it's like, talking to a lot of, and that sentence kind of really didn't make as much sense as I wanted to, but I'll try to illustrate it with a point. So as my wife is seeing right now, talking on the microphone is a very challenging thing some days.
Well, I can talk a little bit about the study that you were referring to.
Okay, well let me prattle on about this for one hot second. Then I was talking to a young fellow the other day, and he again used the term my depression, and I looked at him and I said, you have to understand. He was talking about his father and some of the difficulties he was having. And that's fine, and I'm happy to listen. And he said something very fascinating. He said, my depression. My father doesn't understand my depression. And I looked at him and I said, I don't think it's so much that your father doesn't understand your depression as much as your father doesn't understand the vernacular. That is, and I had to explain it to him. I said, this is odd because it used to be, going back to what I said a few minutes ago, it used to be saying, I'm depressed, this sucks. And I said, well, let's be honest, being 17 in and of itself sucks. It's not fun. It's not an enjoyable time. There's a lot of reasons for you to be depressed right now. I get it. I totally get it. I look at the world today and I'm asking myself, how can you not be depressed? It's like, how can you even be happy or even mildly joyful in this world when everything against you is so fake and obfuscated and completely twisted around and warped? And I could go on about that one. But, just trying to explain to him, it's like there is a difference between how your father is approaching mental health and how you're approaching it. And the vernacular is just so foreign. When we were growing up, we did not treat depression as like a cancerous malady. We treated it as something, okay, I'm depressed. Why am I depressed? And then hopefully you figure it out and then you eliminate the cause. So you were talking about the study that you were going to refer to.
There was a study done in the early 90s. I don't remember the name of the gentleman who did the study, but they were studying the hypothalamus of gay men, deceased gay men. And they noticed that in their study that the hypothalamus of these men, these bodies that they were observing were larger than in the supposedly, non-homosexual population. And that sort of led to the conclusion, the causation, if you will, which if anybody knows their statistics, we know that correlation is not necessarily causation. But it led them to conclude, maybe falsely, that you're just born that way. See, here is physiological proof. The hypothalamus is larger. That must indicate that you are simply hardwired this way and that sexuality, like so many things, is immutable. However, as John mentioned earlier, how can we divorce our mental state, mental health, if you will, from the environment, from the life choices that we make, from the volitional acts that we engage in every day. We all recognize that things like type 2 diabetes happen because of poor dietary choices, poor lifestyle choices, what you are physically putting into your body in the form of food and beverages and things like that. In the same way, it's so difficult to imagine that our mental health, our mental state of being is also affected by what we put into ourselves through what we watch, through the conversations that we have, through the relationships that we engage in, through our jobs even. How many people do you know who go to work and just absolutely hate their jobs and are utterly miserable? We have a handful of friends who just cannot...
Small handful.
Small handful of friends who just are frustrated day in and day out by the jobs that they have. And you cannot tell me that does not have an effect on what we like to term mental health. Again, back in the 90s, we had terms like serotonin and dopamine thrown around, which was again tied in with the whole, chemical imbalance. Since I have a lower number of these chemicals in my brains, I just must need to take medication that will increase the level of these chemicals in my brain. But again, we're trying to make this correlation and say that there's a direct causal relationship. But like so many things with the physiological nature of the brain, we simply do not know. Unlike so many other things in the medical field, like height, weight, blood pressure, blood sugar, we can go into a laboratory and we can test and weigh and measure these things, but you can't go into the brain and objectively say what is happiness, what is sadness. It's all very subjective versus objective. A lot of times in the mental health field or counseling or psychology or psychiatry, you'll be asked on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel? 1 being bad, 10 being really good. And a person will say, 5. Okay, well, what does a 5 look like? What does a 5 objectively represent? We can't really say, okay, what, it equals a certain amount of dopamine or serotonin in your brain, because we simply cannot access that. I cannot go into your brain and actually figure out, what the levels of these things are. There's a reason that study that I mentioned had to be done after these men had passed away, was because we cannot dissect the brain in that manner. And so we're trying to make these causal claims about the physiological nature of the brain when we simply cannot do that. And in a lot of cases, this goes back to a lot of the stuff that was done back in the 1950s, where a lot of this mental health medication was first being created and studied. What they did was they noticed that when they gave a bunch of schizophrenic patients certain medication, they either got happier or sadder. And they're like, well, if it works on the schizophrenics, that we must be able to generalize to the overall population. And so what you saw is, again, if we tweak this chemical, then we see this result. But we're not really 100% sure why it does what it does. And in fact, if you know anything about mental health medication, you know that it affects different people differently, and there's always side effects, and we're always tweaking dosages, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work, which again is proof positive that we cannot make the causal claims that we are making about mental health medication. We cannot make the causal claims that we are making saying your mental state of being is directly tied to the physiological chemicals in your brain, because what you are doing is cutting out your experience. Again, what are we feeding ourselves mentally? What are the relationships that we are having? What are the actions that we are engaging in? It'd be like a person who's allergic to strawberries, eats some strawberries, and comes down with a rash and says, well, it wasn't my fault. I'm just, born this way. It just happened this way. We know the causal relation. We recognize that what we put into our physical bodies has an effect on our physical health. In the same way, what we put into our mental selves, into our minds, will also have an effect. Who hasn't had a child who watches a scary movie and comes running and saying, mommy, I'm scared? Why? You recognize that they have done something, watched a scary movie, or, seen something scary that is a direct result on their emotional experience. Mental health, mental illness, as we like to coin it, is no different.
Well, and it's interesting, especially it's interesting in today's day and age when we have kind of divorced culpability. Like we're all innocent. Everybody's innocent, and I can speak from this one. Man cheats on his wife, okay, and we get that, been there, done that. The question is why, and the question is what were the results of that? Of course, there's depression, there's frustration, there's anxiety, you're worried about getting caught, and then there's sadness, and da da da. It's like we are very causal creatures. And going back to your study, I just want to point out that both my wife and I. We don't support that study, the one with the gay men where they like sliced open their heads and they're like, oh, here we go. This is why. Because the science is so bad. Like you can't just sit down and say, well, look, here's 13 dead guys. There we go. We're going to slice their heads open. And we found all this commonality. Well, my first commonality that I would look at and say, well, they're all dead, so that's number one. So there's a big commonality, and two, you've got way too many confounds in your study that it's like you can't make that determination. You just simply can't. I could make a lot of determinations about a lot of people based on some interesting repetitive patterns. But it's interesting to me today that if you look at the timeline, this is kind of a vaguish, broadish timeline. And I'm going to totally admit to that. But you look at, say, like the 80s, like the concepts of Prozac, and that's kind of when I remember this happening. It's like all of a sudden, and it seemed predominantly geared towards women. And that was interesting to me because I remember this now and I'm thinking about it. It's like I very distinctly remember more women being given Prozac than men. Now, I did know a few men, sure, but I do predominantly remember women being the ones who were being prescribed all these medications. And a lot of times there was a commonality. It's like the 80s, we started to see a lot of excess. We started to see a lot of materialism. I mean, goodness gracious, Madonna sung about it. I'm just a material girl in a material world. I mean, that is the Madonna. You can learn a lot about a culture listening to their entertainment. And we can learn a lot about our culture by listening to today's entertainment too. That's neither here nor there. Maybe a topic for another time. But you see that materialism grow, and it seems that as the concepts of materialism, of this fabricated reality of what we should like and what we should enjoy and what we should be doing, comes with it a negative response, a gross response. I'll use a really great example: Christmas time. The way we do Christmas is not instituted by God or Christianity in any capacity, generally speaking. I'm not saying that the particular day is not meant as a celebratory day, but how we approach it, sorry for that peek, by the way, how we approach it is something that we as a society have fabricated. Watch. There is nowhere anywhere that says that we have an obligation to buy presents for people. And this is literally a social construct that we as a society have created. So we have this idea that we're supposed to be happy, we're supposed to be joyful, we're supposed to be thankful, we're supposed to believe, and you see it all the time. Believe in what? You're giving me an abstract idea with no objectivity. And now all of a sudden you have this month where everything is heightened and everything is supposed to be this and supposed to be that. And I'm still scratching my head going, why? What are we celebrating? Now, for the Christian, generally speaking, you would be celebrating the birth, or at least not the day, but the metaphor of the birth of our Lord and Savior. And for the Christian, it's like, I think that's a lot to celebrate for. But I'm not here to talk about that in this particular instance. For the rest of the world, you're supposed to be all of these things. You're supposed to be surrounded by family and friends. You're supposed to be this. You're supposed to be that. And the day comes, and here's the celebration, and nothing. And nothing. So when you look at that from a cognitive standpoint, you're being built up all the way up here, but the reality is you're all the way down here. And you can't sit down and look me in the face and tell me that that is not a causal relationship to depression. Because that is a classic expectation not met with a reality not met with the expectation of the reality. We are causing ourselves to be depressed. It's like Instagram. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love Instagram. Everybody's always happy on Instagram. Therefore, I should always be happy. Well, you have this expectation of what you're supposed to be, met with the reality of what you actually are be, and when the reality and the expectation do not meet together, then I would say that that's going to cause a lot of cognitive dissonance. And that's why it's like growing up, and I think it took you a long time to really reconcile this with me. It's like, I didn't celebrate Christmas. I was just like, why do I need a special day to spend with my friends and my family? I love you guys all the time. Why do I need a special day to buy a gift for a friend? I love buying gifts for my friend. If I see something for a friend that I like, I'm like, hey, so-and-so would like this. I'm going to buy. I don't need December 24th to do that. December 24th is for something different. But I do this all the time. The December 25th. It shows how much I really actually care, right? I can't even figure out what day it is. But you don't need a day to do. You do it all the time. My father famously said to me all the time, because this was the language and the vernacular being used, spend quality time with your children. And I asked my father this once when I was a kid. I said, Dad, do we ever spend quality time together? We're supposed to spend quality time together. I was probably about like 13 or 14 or something like that. And he looked at me and he said, John, any time I spend with you is quality time. And I was stupefied because you had the authorities over here saying one thing, and then I had my father over here saying that all the time we spend together is quality time. All this time we spend together is precious. Oh, okay. So wait a minute. So we're categorizing wrong. We're trying to make a category for people that are not actually spending time with their children and their family, what they're supposed to be doing. I think Chris Rock had a really great comedy skit about what you're supposed to be doing, you know? And I think that is a big cause of it. You know, we've created the monster of mental health because of literally what we think we're supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm. And this, you know, again, ties back into what we were saying. And yeah, I guess I should have clarified about the study with the hypothalamus. You know, they're making these claims about what the physiology is trying to, what they think the physiology determines. But at the end of the day, we simply don't know because, again, we're completely cutting out of the equation a really, really important factor. And that is one's actions, the environment, what we engage in. And I think this is a very important consideration, sort of springboarding off of what John was saying. You know, what is the cultural narrative that we are being told? And by narrative, I mean, you know, what is the pattern of behavior that our society and our culture expects out of us? And I think Christmas is a really good example of that very thing. Like John was saying, you know, we have this expectation that we need trees and lights and presents and food, and nobody's saying that these are bad things in and of themselves. I love cooking. I do it all the time.
You do it very, very well, by the way.
And, you know, I love eating what I cook all the time.
I do too.
I enjoy decorating. I'm really bad at it, but, you know, I enjoy hanging the lights and putting the tree up and the flowers and the poinsettias and everything. But again, there's this expectation that if we don't do these things, or if these things aren't done by a certain time, I have one friend who, you know, if she doesn't do these things, then she's a bad mom. I'm like, well, where did that come from? Where did this narrative, this cultural narrative of what it means to be a good parent or a bad parent, or, you know, celebrating the season or not celebrating the season? You know, if we're not walking around throughout the entire month of December, starting with the day after Thanksgiving, if we're not walking around in this blissful state of Christmas awe, if you will, then there must be something wrong with us. You know, the cultural narrative, the script for our lives that have been written for us by society, culture, and maybe there's intentionality behind it, maybe there isn't, and I think that can be a topic for another day. The zeitgeist, if you will, of any culture, is it intentional? Is somebody, you know, sort of at the helm of culture driving us one way or another? Or is it sort of just all random happenstance, you know? But suffice to say, there is a script that we're given, rather explicitly or implicitly, of how we ought behave and how we ought act, and again, especially during Christmas time. And if we don't follow the script, then, you know, we're bad moms, or we're bad people, or we're humbugs, or we're Scrooges, or there must be something wrong with us.
Christmas with the Cranks. I got that as a book. I remember that because your family didn't understand why I was like against this concept of Christmas. And to be sure, I might have been a little obnoxious about it too. But it was funny because, you know, it's like, oh, you're a humbug. You don't want to celebrate Christmas. But you know, can I interject for a moment, or do you want to? Well, go. Okay, I'm sorry.
Well, just again, to finish along this thought of, you know, what is the narrative or the script that we're given. There's a really fascinating book called The Globalization of the American Psyche that really delves into how, what we coin mental health or mental illness is extremely culturally bound in the way that it manifests itself. And if you go to other cultures, like in the Japanese culture or the various African nations, or even in some countries in Europe or South America, the way that we in the West, in America, experience, again, what we're coining mental health or mental illness, the way that it manifests itself is very, very different than how it manifests itself or even how it's dealt with in other cultures, in other societies, and most importantly, in other times. Again, mental health, psychology, psychiatry is a very, very new science, and I have air quotes here because, it is what we consider a soft science. It is very subjective versus objective. It cannot be weighed and measured in a laboratory the same way physics and chemistry and mathematics and these other hard science, empirical sciences can be weighed and measured. The discipline in and of itself is maybe 100, 150 years old, and it's making claims about the human condition based on a very small strata of time and what we like to call sample sizes or people, generally in the West, generally in America. And if you notice, there's so many studies that when we try and take these DSM diagnostic parameters and apply them to other cultures, it simply does not work. And any psychologist or psychiatrist or social worker or counselor worth their salt will readily admit that there is an issue when we try and take our framework for the phenomenological experience, what we're calling mental health or mental illness, and apply this framework to other cultures and other peoples. It does not work. It falls apart, which again is proof positive and I think shows strongly how much mental health and mental illness is culturally bound. It has to do with this narrative, this script that culture has given us, and whether we measure up to it or don't measure up to it. Who wrote it? Who gave it to us? Again, going back to the example of my friend who said she's a bad mom. Well, who told you that? Who gave you this list? Tell me the checklist of what this criteria are that you're either a bad mom or a good mom. And when people sort of, stumble and grapple with this and come up empty, it's like, exactly, where did this come from? When you need to find that out, you need to dig down deep and figure out where did these assumptions come from.
And to be sure, and we have to be careful with that statement, because society is built on axioms. Society is built on social constructs. Absolutely, it is. It 100% is. You cannot have a functioning, successful society that is not built on axioms and social constructs, and that is extremely important to understand, because this what we're saying right now could absolutely be used in a negative way. We're just going to tear down a wall because there's a wall there, and we don't know why that wall's there. Therefore, we should just tear it down. You have to be absolutely careful when you say that, because we need to have structures. We need to have borders and boundaries. This is very, very important in existence.
Can I interject?
Yeah, please interject for a hot minute.
Well, the quote is by G.K. Chesterton. Don't tear down a fence until you know why it was built.
Yeah. No, and it's funny because I thought I coined that statement, and then my wife was like, "Do you know G.K. Chesterton?" I'm like, "Well, this is before we met, or before we were married." I was like, "No," and she's like, "Oh, well, he said that," and I'm like, "No, he didn't. I did." Another example of, doing your math right, I guess you could say. So the thing is, a society is absolutely based on constructs and axioms. You can't get away from it. There is a reason why we in America, according to the Britons, drive on the wrong side of the road, which I would say that they're absolutely wrong. We drive on the right side of the road, and I know we drive on the right side of the road because we're on the right side of the road. We don't drive on the left side of the road. So we're right, they're wrong. And we could argue that all day long. However, if I went into, say, Britain and I drove on the left side, if I drove on the right side of the road, I would be going against their societal constructs. And that would be, of course, a big problem. We don't want to do that. But we do, there are a lot of societal constructs and social constructs and acts that aren't really axiomatic, that are more assumed than anything else. I can use another great example, the concept of going on vacation. Everybody wants to go to Disney World for some godforsaken reason, which I have yet to understand in my life. And I cannot reconcile in my mind why anybody would want to walk into this fabricated reality of a place and spend the ridiculous amount of money that they do. Yet here they are. We're going to Disney World. We're going to be happy. And we're going to be happy because we're being told to be happy. And I'm looking at this and I see the pictures of people, and I've seen pictures of people for the past 20 or 30 years of my existence. And I've looked at all of them and I've said, are you really that happy? Because you look really kind of not terribly happy. You look kind of miserable here. But yet there's a societal expectation that if I go to the magical, what is it called? The happiest place on earth, or
the happiest place on earth, the most magical place on earth.
Yeah. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, this isn't magical and this isn't happy. Y'all look miserable.
And if I can speak to that, having been there, I think 5 or 6 times.
Yikes.
As a child. I think the first time I went was when I was 2 or 3. Maybe when I was a 7 or 8 in middle school, and then a couple of times when I was in high school. And certainly when you're a child, you know, there can definitely be something magical about that. I mean, anytime you walk into a place as a small child, everything's bigger and strange and mysterious because you're still learning about the world. And so, yeah, in a sense, it can be magical, but you know, when I went when I was an older teenager, I mean, it's just like going to any other amusement park, and you wait in lines, and everyone's hot and cranky from having been out all day, and we're standing in lines, and it's overpriced food, and I mean, it certainly wasn't magical at that point.
And I think, you know, it's called growing up, you know, and I still to this day, even though the invitation has been granted to me, I have no desire to go. I don't want to waste my time to go because I just have no interest in these things. And I think you could say that about a lot of things, especially in our world today. And to me, it's no wonder that so many people are depressed. Not feeling, but like are legitimately depressed because there is there is an expectation of reality, and then it is met with the actual real of reality.
Can you define what you mean by actually are depressed and versus feeling depressed?
Yeah. I'm sorry. I guess you're right. That wasn't very clear. So again, to quantify as one is a result of something as opposed to a proclivity based on like chemical imbalances. You know, my depression is, I guess I didn't word that very well. Don't shake your head no at me. I'm doing my best.
Well, again, the whole point of this conversation was to distinguish between feeling depressed versus having depression,
right? Okay.
And how we've semantically changed how we're defining these things. And so,
okay, so confused. Yeah, okay, so no. I'm just saying it very poorly. So,
it's no wonder people feel depressed.
Yeah, it's no wonder that people. No, I would actually say it's no wonder that people are depressed. No, I would say that the problem. Okay, how I'm quantifying these differently. You'll have to excuse me. Let me just prattle on for a hot second. Okay, the concept of saying my depression suggests that there is no causality of it. There's no actual object reason why you have your depression, so to speak. The problem is that to say I feel depressed means that is indicative that there is a causal reason why you're feeling depressed. So if I were to say my depression, I'm treating it as if like it's a sickness that I just acquired out of nowhere for no real reason, versus I'm depressed indicates that there is a reason or there's a causal reason for your being depressed. That's what I'm trying to say.
So feel depressed and am depressed you're using synonymously because it is not necessarily immutable, and it's able to be changed, and it is not the result of factors that are purely somatic and physiological.
Yes, yeah, that's what I'm saying. So when I'm talking to some of these younger people who come into our shop, you know, why are you depressed? You know, when they say my depression, it's like, okay, well, my question is why are you depressed? You know, what does your depression look like, or what is causing it? And it's oftentimes met with a very strange look at their faces. It's like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, let's look at your world, the culture in which you exist in. And I've used this, I've used this phrase often: fakes, frauds, fabrication, and fictitious reality. Everything that is of this generation is a complete and utter fabrication. I mean, from your friends on social media to the entertainment in which you're being given, to even the cigarettes or not cigarettes that you're smoking, to the movies that you're watching, everything is ripped away from the substance of the thing. And so there's nothing real to bite your teeth into. Even the concept of my depression isn't real. It's like, well, why? Well, my depression. It's like, okay, first off, going back to my young friend, dude, you're 17. You're having problems with your family. Okay, so there is a causal reason for you to be depressed. Your activities that you're engaging in are obviously causing you strife internally. You're trying to reconcile these things. You're surrounded in a world of nothing but rampant materialism. You're being told just simply for, one reason or the other, you're not good enough because of your gender or your skin color, or that you should be like this or like this. And it's like you're so wound up with these expectations and all of these criticisms that are unfounded for one thing or the other. And not only that, we have these little goggle boxes that we stare at all day long. These little, and it's no surprise to me that it's shaped like a big black obelisk, talking about archetypes and whatnot. So it's no surprise to me. Yes, of course, I think there's a lot of reasons for you to be depressed. It's not just some ethereal thing that just popped out of nowhere. There's a reason for this, man, and we need to reconcile this reason. We need to figure this out.
And most people, and in fact, I was having a conversation with a young woman just the other day, they do recognize the detrimental effects of constantly being bombarded with social media. This particular young woman was talking about how she's always lonely and feels alone, and she very quickly and correctly recognized that all of the media that she receives on her phone, whether it's through Snapchat or TikTok, or I guess there's a new one called Marco Polo. And we were having a conversation about teenage drama or what have you, and she recognized that, when I approached this person, I probably shouldn't have used Marco Polo, because there's this divide and this disconnect between, when you have a conversation with a person face to face, you do self-edit. You don't say or do things in a face-to-face conversation versus when it's online where you're typing, or I guess with Marco Polo, you record a video, or with TikTok, little 10-second blurbs, or Snapchat, where again it's just these quick little envelopes of information where you feel more free to say and do things that you wouldn't say and do in a face-to-face conversation. But more importantly, when we no longer have these face-to-face conversations and interactions with people, is it really any wonder that we all feel so lonely and isolated, where the only interaction that we get is through, what do you call it, the goggle box? The black oogle box, or whatever you call it.
The goggle box. I'll actually tell you where I got that from. That was kind of a quote from a Marvel comic. From I can't remember the guy. I think it was in Generation Next, and it was kind of like an offshoot of the X-Men. And there was this one particular character. His name was Chamber, I think it was. It was an interesting series. It's kind of like one of those spin-off of X-Men, and he made this comment. It always stuck with me about people who are sitting in front of the goggle box. Now, of course, at the time he was referring to the television. I think his character was supposed to be British or something like that, but that's kind of where I picked it up, in case you were wondering where that was coming from. But yeah, we stare at this. We stare at the damn thing all day long, and what are you doing? You're getting nothing more than excessive hits of dopamine all the time. It's like TikTok. TikTok is nefarious. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think it's interesting, but I had to.
I think the word you're looking for is inane.
Yeah. Well, there's that too, but
waste of time.
Actually, yeah, it is a time suck, because you could just be sitting there in 1 minute snippets of watching all people doing all sorts of things, and before you know it, half hour and an hour has passed, and it's like.
And as a quick side, we've discussed before between the two of us about how we no longer have the attention spans to really fully delve into or digest what we're reading, because all of our information comes in. How much is Twitter now? 240 characters,
it doubled,
10-second videos.
280.
And you yourself have commented how when you're trying to read, maybe a book on philosophy or theology or history, that you it's hard for you to follow the train of thought, because our brains are being rewired to only be able to handle information coming at us in small little snippets and packages, almost like a what do you call it, an elevator pitch?
Yeah, an elevator.
Where you have the however much long it takes to go from one floor to the next in an elevator. And so when you sit down and try and read, a book or a magazine article or something that's longer and requires you to follow the author's thought and argument through not only multiple paragraphs, but maybe even multiple pages or even an entire book, we find that we simply cannot sustain our attention, and our ability to connect one thought to the next is shattered.
Well, not only that, you see that in movies too, and you see that in YouTube as well. The hard cuts. Oh my goodness, I hate the hard cuts. It's so annoying. And why do we have these hard cuts? Because that's the amount of time that you have to get a thought out, and boom, hard cut to the next, hard cut to the next. Oh, God bless you. We just have those hard cuts where it's like the scenes are one thought, hard cut. Next thought, hard cut. Next thought, hard cut. There's no actual natural flow of that. And movies are the same way. You see that all the time in these movies. Now, they're a little bit more subdued in their hard cuts from one scene to the other, but how many times have we seen a movie and we're watching it and it's like, this is literally just one scene to the next. There's no real flow of the movie. There's no real consistency to that. So it's everywhere. Like, it's not just on the TikTok or the TikTok, excuse me. It's not just on the YouTube.coms. It's not just on the Facebooks.
There's this website called youtube.com.
Hi. Okay, I'm not going to do that. That'd be terrible. My name is okay. We're gonna stop with that train of thought. Okay, yes.
But here's it's not an anecdotal story. It's actually a story that another gentleman that we're really good friends with told us. He was explaining about these African Christians who, I don't remember which particular country they were from, but
Africa.
they were Christians. They were devout Christians, but they experienced extreme suffering and persecution in their country of origin. They were able to escape that and were able to successfully immigrate over to America, where our friends ended up, coming in contact with them. And he said something really fascinating, that once entering America and being sort of integrated into American culture and society, they both suddenly became extremely depressed. And he said it was interesting because when they were talking to him, they said, it's baffling to us because when we were over in our native land and we were experiencing suffering and persecution, we were joyful. We had peace. It was hard. It was terrible. It was difficult. But when we came here, suddenly it was like this black blanket of despair just settled over us. And again, kind of bringing this back to where we started in this conversation. Yeah. Is what we are coining mental health and mental illness purely a physiological state of being that is simply the chemicals in our brain doing wonky things, and it's like a cold or a flu or cancer. It is simply something that happens to us. We have no control over it. Or, as we have hopefully demonstrated in this last bit, there's more to this story. Again, we're not ruling out that the chemicals in our brains do very strange things. However, that's not the whole story. We are more than just body. We are also mind. And the experiences and the environment and the relationships and what we are feeding our minds plays a huge role, and we simply cannot divorce that from the story of what we are calling mental health. And again, hopefully we've demonstrated that through the various examples that we've cited, that when the narrative makes the claim that you simply have depression, like you would have cancer or have a cold or have a viral infection, and that it's simply a matter of taking a pill and everything being better, and we got to make those chemicals in your brain more balanced out. You're divorcing from the equation. What are you putting into your mind? What are the conversations you're having? What are the actions you're engaging in? Again, with the diabetic, we recognize the type 2 diabetes. You eat lots of sugar and have a poor lifestyle, that's going to affect you. In the same manner, look at the social media look at the relationships that we have. It's only through social media. Look at the media that we watch, the highlight reel that we like to call it of social media, where we're constantly bombarded all day with people's happy lives, but we never get to see the sadness and the struggle. It's always happy. What does that tell us? Again, why do we feel like my friend felt that we're bad moms or bad people? Because the script and the narrative that has been handed to us tells us something, and somehow we don't feel like we live up to that.
And not only that, it's almost like we've made feeling bad anathema in a sense. It's like, well, do you feel this? Do you feel that? Take a pill. And it's like, wait a minute here. Why do I feel this way? What is causing me to feel this way? Am I working in a job 9 to 5 where I'm sitting in front of a computer? And I was talking to another friend about this last night, and she made an interesting comment, and she's been a good friend over the years, and I've known her for a very long time, and she made an interesting comment about some of the things that she's doing, and I kind of do jump on her a little about this, but I'm like, look, you're filling your life with meaninglessness. And that, I think, really ultimately is the key, is what we fill our lives with. We can sit down and go from one thing to the next. We can, we can buy, just to give you a little self-disclosure, synthesizer modules or Magic the Gathering cards or cars or motorcycles or this or that. We could just have random sexual experiences with one person or the other. So what? at the end of the day, really, so what? I can post all the pictures on Instagram that shows me how happy I am because I'm doing the stupid follow me wherever I go, lead the way nonsense.
YouTube.com.
YouTube, yeah, I can go onto YouTube.com and I can get meaning. I'm deriving meaning from all of these things. But at the end of the day, they are meaningless. They have no meaning because one, they're here and gone for the next. They're here to entertain me for a little bit. But what great works, what any kind of work have I produced? Have I helped out anybody? Have I given anybody a little bit of assistance or aid? What meaning is there? And I think, my personal opinion on this one, I think that one of the reasons that we are such a depressed society, not I have the depressions, but I'm feeling depressed, that we are facing this rampant concept of depression is because we filled our lives with meaninglessness. We have no purpose. To coin a book that I read many years ago, we are amusing ourselves to death. That's what we are doing, whether it be the YouTube.coms, whether it be Pornhub, whether it be 4chan or Reddit or whatever you want to. We are living in a society and a world where we are just amusing ourselves to death and stupidity. So it's no wonder, I am feeling depressed. Well, yes, because you're not doing anything. You have no purpose. You have no goal. You have nothing to go towards. And to be sure, I certainly do. I could get into that later, but I gave up all that. Yeah, I like doing these things. They're fun. Even this podcast that my wife and I are doing. Yes, it's good. It's fun. But we're doing it in order to help people overcome their feelings of depression and recognizing that there is a causality. The message is not just, oh, you're depressed, go to the doctor and whatever. It's, no, examine your life. Temet nos. Look at yourself. Examine yourself. Know yourself. And I think there was some Jewish guy, some Jewish rabbi who said something about that, examine yourself, pick up your cross and bear it.
Actually, speaking of Jewish people, I actually wanted to bring up a gentleman back when philosophy and psychology were slightly more indistinguishable. His name was Viktor Frankl. I can't remember the name of the book, Pursuit of Meaning or Life Has Meaning. In any case, here's a gentleman who went through the Holocaust. Terrible, terrible thing. And he writes about his experience in this book. And he actually was sort of one of those psychologists in the early years of psychology, again, where it was this almost indistinguishable from philosophy. But, he wrote about his experience in the Holocaust. And he was explaining, you had the people who were experiencing these horrible things. Some of them just gave in to despair and, couldn't overcome. But then you had other people who were able to come around each other and support each other in a community. And what is the difference? It's not just the circumstances. It's not just the environment. It's not just the biology. But there's a synthesis of all of those. If you're familiar with Gestalt theory, the sum total, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. It's more than just one thing or the other. It's not just nature or nurture, nature and nurture. It's a synthesis of both, and one of those being meaning and purpose. What is the very foundation of your life? What is the thing that feeds into your goals and your dreams and your pursuits? What is it that gives your life meaning and purpose? And if you can find that out, if you can start to answer that question, I think most people go a long way to understanding why they may or may not feel depression.
And I think at the end, it's like, when we do want to wrap this up because I don't want to prattle on too long, even though the time that we're doing this is arbitrary. We determined it, we determined the social construct for how long we're going to do this. Isn't that fun? But the thing is that when you are seeking meaning and purpose, is it real? Is it something that's tangible? There's a lot of things that we do to entertain ourselves and to bide the time between moment to moment. But and I think really if we can look at these things objectively and say that I am engaging in eating nothing more than candy. I'm not eating meat, so to speak. There's a metaphor. If you're a vegetarian, I don't care. Whatever. I'm eating substance. The point is I'm eating something of substance. My wife brought up the Jews and the Holocaust. Yes, I think they had a very, very, very good reason to feel like they were in despair. So did the Armenians. So did the Chinese during the Cultural Revolution. So did the Russians during the Bolshevik Revolution. So did the American people in the Depression era. Yes, there's a reason, and there's a reason for these things. But what is it that allows people to come together during these times of persecution and hardship? It's like they can still be joyful. And that's interesting to me. And I think one of it really does come down to, in many cases, is that we don't want to treat sadness, frustration as an important emotion that we absolutely have to feel, much like joy and happiness. They are important. But the question is why are we happy? Why are we sad? Why are we joyful? Why are we depressed? Why are we elevated? Why are we all of these things? And I don't think we're answering these questions. I don't think we're even asking these questions. I don't think we know to ask these questions.
And I think that's important to understand, that it takes a hard work sometimes to figure these things out. In
work.
Society where so much is just handed to us, where anything that is uncomfortable or gives discomfort, we can simply take a pill, take a shot, whatever.
Ban them and say you're not
right.
safe.
If something makes us uncomfortable, we can simply shut our eyes and ignore it. But what we cannot ignore and shut our eyes to is our own personal emotions and experiences. And it is hard work to figure out what's going on, why is this happening? But it is worth the work, and an interesting distinction about humanity versus the other animals and the other, life on this planet. Everything else, barring humanity, doesn't have a choice but to be what it is. It's humans where we can either become more ourselves or less of ourselves. There's a process where we have to take a little baby and raise them and train them up to be adults. A puppy has no choice but to become a dog. A kitten has no choice but to become a cat. But there's an intentionality behind what we do with our children and our young people. And that goes to show that things take hard work, and nothing worth doing is ever easy, least of all when it comes to what we call reality and our mental health.
And I want to throw one last thing in, and isn't it interesting when we're coming down to the end, that we live in a society that you can do no wrong. We live in a society that has taken the concepts of sin, and I'm using sin as not in a sense, yes, the biblical sense, but I'm expounding upon that. But we live in a society that do as thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. I can do no wrong. Wrong and right are as subjective as the wind. And by the way, the wind is not subjective. The wind does have an order to it. But we want to pretend that right and wrong, good and evil, these are just whims based on how we feel at the moment. And how do you broach that? How do you look at somebody? In a lot of cases, we're living in Plato's cave. How do you broach somebody and say, what you are doing is fundamentally wrong? It is wrong for your soul, for your heart, for your health, for your mental health. What you're doing is wrong. We can look at the heroin addict and say, what you're doing is bad. But you can't look at somebody who engages in, say, pornography or licentious sexual relations, 24 hours a day. You can't look at them and say, what you're doing is wrong. And that, I think, in and of itself, because at least the rest of the world, a lot of other parts of the world would say, okay, no, this is wrong. Right. Anyways, that's the end of it. That's about all we got. We don't want to prattle on too long. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me talk. Today.
Did I do okay?
Did I do okay?
I think you did fine. Okay. I hope somebody listens to this and gets something out of it. I'll be rendering it lately. But anyways, I want to say thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this discourse between my wife and I. It was something that we just wanted to do for fun, but also because these are the conversations that we have on a daily basis. These are the things that we talk about and philosophize about. And there's a little bit of arrogance, I think, to say that I hope that what we have to philosophize and say has a bit of meaning to somebody. But I hope you listen to this. I hope you enjoy this. I hope somebody listens to this, and I hope you glean something from it. And that is important. And if anything, is this the end-all purpose of our day? No, this is actually just a tertiary augmentation of that which we do anyways. And we do this with real people in real life on a daily basis. So I want to say thank you very much for listening if you did. And until next time, good day.